My name is Margaret, and I am 68 years old. On a chilly autumn morning, I packed a basket of fragrant cookies, eager to bring them to my grandson, Luke, who had just turned 5. Standing at my daughter-in-law Samantha's door, my heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Samantha, whom the neighbors always complimented for being sweet and polite, opened the door. Samantha forced a smile and invited me in, but her gaze was distant and her tone was cold. Just then, Luke barreled out, shouting, "Grandma," which made my heart melt. But before I could stretch out my arms to embrace him, Samantha pulled her son back toward her. The living room air grew heavy. Every remark Samantha made was curtly polite, and her eyes kept flicking to the clock as if she wanted me to leave quickly. I gathered my courage and spoke softly. "Samantha, this weekend I'd like to take Luke for a few days so he can spend more time with his grandparents." Before I finished, Samantha cut me off with a voice that remained quiet but carried a blade of frost. "You are not fit to be my son's mother." My heart stopped. I sat frozen, my hands gone cold. Those words, coming from the very woman who once called me mother, were like a knife plunged straight into my chest. The world blurred. All I could hear was my own heartbeat and Samantha's stern face. I wanted to speak, to ask why, but my throat tightened. In the end, I only nodded, forcing myself not to let a single tear fall in front of her. I rose, took the unopened basket of cookies, and walked out of the house. Luke called after me, but his small voice was stopped by his mother's hand. Outside on the porch, the autumn wind swept past, swirling yellow leaves around my feet. I walked as if through a nightmare. Images of Daniel, my only son, flooded in. He had been gone, killed in a car accident just a year before. Luke was the only remaining link I had to Daniel, the sole comfort that helped me bear that loss. And now even that link was being severed. I quietly boarded the bus home, clutching the old scarf Daniel had once given me on a distant Christmas. Through the misted window, the streets slid by like a blurred film. I didn't know when I began to cry. I only knew my hands were clenched so tight they trembled. A heavy feeling rose in me. I had already lost my son, and now I was losing the right to be a grandmother. I rested my head against the glass and exhaled, trying to swallow the sobs. I returned home in silence. The house, already emptier since Daniel's death, felt even colder. I tried to open the door as gently as possible and moved like a shadow, not wanting George to notice how shaken I was. He suffered from chronic heart disease. His health was failing day by day, and I could not let him worry anymore. I set the cookie basket down on the table and didn't bother to open it. In the dim living room, the curtains stirred in the breeze, and I sank into the old armchair. My eyes fell automatically on the framed photograph placed neatly on the shelf, a picture of Daniel, our only son. His gentle smile remained, but every time I looked, I felt my heart rip a little more. Memories surged as clear as if they had happened yesterday. Daniel had been a beautiful son. Even when work kept him busy, he called us every night to check on George and me, sometimes simply to say, "Mom, I ate dinner today. Don't worry." On holidays, he always brought Samantha and Luke to our house, bringing laughter with him. I remember clearly when he once told me, when Luke was just learning to walk, "Mom, this little boy will need you a lot in the future." That sentence echoes in my mind like an unfinished promise. Samantha had been the kind of woman neighbors and friends praised as sweet, well-mannered, and polite. After marrying Daniel, she gave outsiders the impression of a perfect daughter-in-law. I used to believe that until the cracks began to show, especially after the day Daniel died. Now the void Daniel left behind was not only the loss of a son, but the loss of the family's anchor. I had intended in my meeting with Samantha today to bring up the draft of a will I had written. In it, I planned to leave this house and the life savings I had accumulated to Samantha so she could raise Luke with peace of mind, and he would have a secure future. All those plans sprang from my love for my grandson and my trust in my daughter-in-law. But Samantha's single icy sentence, "You are not fit to be my son's mother," shattered that trust. It crushed the good intentions I had nurtured. I quietly wondered to myself, if Daniel were still alive, What would he think to see his wife deliberately severing the bond between grandmother and grandson like this? How much would that hurt him? I closed my eyes and let the tears flow. Since losing my son, I have tasted the deepest pain. I had thought Luke would be the thread that kept me tethered to life, a small light in the darkness. Now that light too was being dimmed by someone's selfish hands. A weak voice called from the bedroom. "Margaret, are you all right?" It was George. I hurriedly wiped my cheeks, took a deep breath, and answered in a steady voice. "I'm fine. Go to sleep." I heard his quiet cough and the bed creak as he turned. That alone made my chest ache. I could not let him know that I was falling apart. He needed calm, not another storm. I turned to the photograph of Daniel and, with trembling fingers, touched my son's face in the frame. I whispered, "I had planned to give everything to your family, but my son, was I wrong?" In the darkness, the question echoed. No one answered except the pounding of my own heart. The draft remained in the drawer, not yet taken out. I had written it during long, sleepless nights. Every line came from a desire to protect my grandson. But now that draft felt like a burden. I knew I could not give all my assets and Luke's future into the hands of someone who had so flatly denied the bond between them. Outside, the autumn wind howled through the window frame, carrying with it a bone-chilling cold. I wrapped tightly in the shawl Daniel once gave me, holding it as if I were holding my son himself. My heart felt unbearably heavy, as though I were carrying all the sorrow of the world. On one side was the boundless love I had for Luke. On the other, the bitter betrayal of Samantha. I knew that sooner or later I would have to make a decision. But tonight, all I could manage was to sit here in the darkened room, listening to the ticking of the old clock and feeling each teardrop fall onto my frail hands. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the painful images that kept coming back. But the more I wanted to forget, the clearer they became. Luke's radiant smile, the look of expectation pulled back behind his mother's arms, and those cold, icy words. My heart felt shattered. I told myself I could no longer remain silent forever. Yet in this moment, all I could do was sigh and continue to bury the storm raging inside me. In the days after that meeting, my mind found no peace. I was grieving and bewildered, as if the whole world were deliberately turning its back on me. And yet, the love I had for Luke would not let me give up. I called Samantha many times, each time gently asking for permission to visit my grandson, just to spend a little while with him. But on the other end of the line, her indifferent voice always had the same response. "Sorry, this week isn't convenient." And so it went, week after week, the refusals polite but cutting straight into my heart. I began going as far as the gate of their house, hoping that even catching a glimpse of Luke from afar would be enough. I stood there holding a small bag of toys or a few packets of cookies I knew he loved. But each time that curtain would be pulled shut, blocking me entirely from view. Samantha's coldness was no longer fleeting. It had become a deliberate effort to shut me out completely. One day, I heard that Luke's preschool was holding a performance. My heart suddenly leapt, thinking that at least in a public setting, Samantha wouldn't dare forbid me so harshly. I got up early, prepared a small bouquet of flowers, and took the bus to the school. The courtyard was full of laughter, parents snapping pictures, cheerful music playing. I blended into the crowd, my eyes following each group of children stepping onto the stage. And then, among the bright uniforms, I saw Luke, his eyes shining, his innocent smile like a little sun. When the performance ended, I couldn't hold back. I slipped forward, hoping to embrace him, give him the bouquet, and take a photo to remember the moment. But before I could touch him, Samantha appeared, blocking my way. Her face no longer held even a trace of politeness. It was cold, firm. "I already told you, you don't need to be part of his life anymore." Those words struck me like a bolt of lightning. I stood frozen under the curious stares of parents and teachers. Some looked at me with pity, some shook their heads, and others avoided my eyes altogether. I remained there, bouquet in hand, motionless like someone utterly lost. Luke was pulled away by Samantha in a rush, but before disappearing through the doorway, He turned back to look at me, his eyes hesitant, filled with both fear and longing. That image pierced my heart, leaving a wound that could never heal. On the bus ride home, swaying with each turn, I stared blankly out the window. Trees along the roadside blurred as they passed. Inside me, a new doubt began to grow. Did Samantha truly want to raise Luke with love? Or to her, was he just a burden, a chain binding her down? Why did Luke's eyes show both fear and yearning when he looked at me? A 5-year-old child should only know love. Why was he being held tight like an object? From that day on, my grief slowly turned into vigilance. I began to realize Samantha might not be the gentle mother she appeared to be in everyone's eyes. She could be hiding something, and Luke was the one suffering most. I thought of Daniel's words long ago. Luke will need his mother very much. But could I really remain silent, letting the boy grow up in a household full of restrictions and coldness? That night, I sat in the kitchen, the yellow light shining down on an old draft of my will. I had once written it with absolute trust, leaving everything to Samantha so she could raise Luke. But now, when I thought of my grandson's eyes, when I remembered the humiliation I had endured before so many people, it was like a storm rising within me. I could not remain blind any longer. I clenched the draft tightly in my hand, my gaze hardening. The time had come for me to change things. Not just for myself, but for Luke, my innocent grandson, who had no choice in who his mother was. If I left everything in Samantha's hands, what would become of him? Would he grow up surrounded by love, or would he be treated only as a tool to hold on to wealth? In that moment, a new seed began to take root in my heart, a seed of awakening. I knew I could not let the years I had left slip away in helplessness. I had to find another way, a safer path for my grandson. And from that moment on, I began preparing for a change that Samantha could never expect. After many sleepless nights, I understood I could no longer hesitate. If I did nothing, Samantha would keep all the power, and Luke would grow up in a suffocating environment. I thought and thought until finally, I decided to reach out to Mr. Thomas Dalton, the man who had once helped our family with Daniel's legal paperwork when he was still alive. Dalton was careful, straightforward, and had witnessed our days of mourning. I trusted he would understand. That morning, I put on my thick coat, carrying my old handbag in which I kept the draft of the will. On the way to his office, my heart pounded, torn between anxiety and hope. Dalton's office was just as I remembered, bookshelves stacked with files, a neat wooden desk, the steady sound of a pendulum clock. When he saw me, he stood and shook my hand, his eyes kind. "Hello, Mrs. Margaret. It's been a long time." I sat down, my hands clasped tightly together. Within just a few minutes of silence, tears welled up in my eyes. I told Dalton everything from the day Daniel died to Samantha's coldness to her keeping me from being near Luke. I did not hide even the humiliation of that day at the school performance when Samantha openly disgraced me in front of everyone. Each word I spoke tore at my heart, but I knew I had to tell the truth, leaving nothing out. Dalton listened, nodding repeatedly, occasionally writing slowly. When I stopped, he set his pen down, his voice steady. "Mrs. Margaret, I understand your pain, but you must remember you have full authority over your own property. The most important thing isn't pleasing anyone, but ensuring what's best for little Luke." I nodded gently. Yes, everything was for Luke, but my heart was still troubled. I still want my grandson to have a good future, but I no longer trust Samantha. I fear handing everything over to her would be a mistake. Wade Dalton pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, speaking slowly. "If you don't trust her, you can choose someone else. Someone truly reliable." His suggestion stopped me cold. A face flashed in my mind. Michael. He was Daniel's childhood best friend, like a brother. Memories came rushing back. Michael at the hospital the night of Daniel's accident, clutching my hand through that dreadful night. Michael at the funeral, quietly managing everything, holding me upright when my legs gave out. Michael in the days after, coming rain or shine to patch the leaking roof, taking George to his heart appointments, bringing toys for Luke. I suddenly realized all this time it was Michael who had stayed closest to our family, never once abandoning us. He wasn't of Gardner blood, but his heart had always been here. I looked straight at Dalton, my voice trembling but firm. If not Samantha, then there is only one person I trust. I want to rewrite my will, leaving everything to Michael Harris. Dalton nodded, not at all surprised, as if he had foreseen this choice. He opened a new file and began drafting. We'll redo everything from the start, fully notarized, so no one can contest it. You can rest easy. I sat there, listening to the scratch of his pen on paper, and a weight slowly lifted from my chest. Though I knew this was a monumental decision, I felt more certain than ever. I was no longer the woman who endured in silence. I was protecting my grandson, the last living piece of Daniel. When I stepped out of the lawyer's office, the autumn wind cut cold, swirling yellow leaves around my feet. But inside me, a glimmer of light pierced the darkness. I lifted my eyes to the gray sky and whispered, "My son, I found a way. Luke won't be left alone. He will be loved, just as you once hoped." I tightened my grip on my bag strap and walked down the street. For the first time in months, my steps were steady. I knew storms still lay ahead. Samantha would not take this quietly. But I also knew I wasn't alone anymore. I had faith, purpose, and an ally, a lifelong friend Daniel had once called a brother. In my heart, the choking bitterness was gone, replaced by quiet determination. Samantha believed I would stay silent, letting her control everything. But soon she would see I was no longer the weak woman she thought I was. That evening, after returning from the lawyer's office, I sat alone in the living room. The familiar house felt strangely alive, filled with memories of Michael. I realized he had entered our lives as if destined, as though Daniel had left behind a brother to watch over us. I recalled the days when Daniel and Michael were still in high school. They were so close people thought they were siblings. They'd play basketball under the yellow glow of the schoolyard lights, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. On autumn mornings, Michael would stop by, nibbling on my baked pies while teasing Daniel before the two of them grabbed baskets and went hunting with George. Back then, I saw Michael as another son, never imagining he'd one day become my support in such a profound way. Even after Daniel married, Michael kept calling, sometimes dropping by for a cup of coffee, checking on us. Daniel often said, "Mom, Michael isn't just a friend, he's my brother. I believe that if one day I'm not here anymore, Michael will still take care of you and Dad." I laughed it off, thinking he was joking. But now those words echoed like a prophecy. I remembered that fateful night of the accident. The phone rang at midnight, and I froze at the dreadful news. When George and I reached the hospital, barely able to stand, it was Michael who ran to support me. He stayed the whole night, holding my hand when the doctor said Daniel hadn't survived. At the funeral, I collapsed from exhaustion, and it was Michael who caught me, crying while keeping me upright. He handled everything from receiving guests to managing the memorial book down to the last detail. After the mourning days passed, I thought people would drift away. But Michael didn't. He still came often, mowing the lawn, climbing the roof to fix leaks, even taking George to checkups when I couldn't. He never needed to be asked. He simply showed up, quietly doing everything. And whenever Luke visited, Michael would sit with him, reading stories, teaching him how to build with blocks. Watching them together filled me with gratitude. I knew no one could replace Daniel, but Michael tried to fill that void with all his heart. He never said it. He just did. That silent devotion only deepened my trust. That night, after George had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and opened an old notebook. I wrote down, "I will leave everything to Michael because I trust he will keep his promise to Daniel to protect Luke and love him as his own." When I closed the notebook, my heart felt lighter. I realized this trust wasn't only for Michael, it was also my way of keeping a part of Daniel alive. Through Michael, I glimpsed my son again in the way he cared for others in his selfless devotion. The next day, when Michael stopped by with some fresh produce from a friend's farm, I stood waiting on the porch. I wanted to thank him, but when I looked into his sincere eyes, I couldn't find the words. I simply reached out to take the bag, whispering, "You still see Luke as your own nephew, don't you?" Michael smiled and nodded firmly. "Yes, ma'am. I have for a long time." Hearing that, I felt warmth spread through me as if I were being comforted by sunlight. For the first time in months, I no longer felt lost. I knew that Daniel, wherever he was, could rest easy because his best friend had kept a vow that was never spoken aloud. I went back inside and saw George sitting propped up against a pillow, his breathing labored, but his eyes lighting up when he saw me smile. He gently asked, "What is it, Margaret?" I only replied, "It's nothing. I just feel lighter now." I didn't want him to worry, but deep down I knew I had found a new source of faith, a place of trust where I could entrust the rest of my life, as well as the future of my little grandson. A few days later, I returned to Mr. Thomas Dalton's office. This time I no longer hesitated or shrank back. I walked in with a determination that even surprised me. Dalton welcomed me with his calm smile, placing a stack of prepared documents in front of me. He spoke slowly, as if to make sure I understood everything. "Mrs. Margaret, the entirety of your estate, the house, the savings, everything you have accumulated in your lifetime will be transferred to Mr. Michael Harris. Once you sign, the documents will be notarized and legally registered immediately beyond dispute." I listened to every word, my heart aching and relieved at once. Aching because I had to accept the truth. I had lost all trust in my daughter-in-law. Relieved because I had finally found a way to protect my grandson. When I picked up the pen to sign my name, my hand trembled, not out of doubt, but because I knew I was doing something monumental. Each shaky stroke of the pen felt like lifting off a burden I had carried for far too long. Walking out of the office, the cold wind made me shiver, but inside, I felt clear. I had my answer. I couldn't change Daniel's death, but at least I could secure Luke's future. What I didn't expect was that while I quietly prepared for this change, Samantha was showing her true colors more and more. She grew bolder by the day. When I called to ask about Luke, I only heard her cold voice respond, "Don't bother us anymore." Once, when I came by with a few gifts, Samantha stood blocking the doorway. Her smile was forced, but her words were sharp as a blade. "From now on, don't show up again. I don't need anyone interfering in my life with my son." Those words pierced my heart, but instead of retreating, I felt my resolve grow stronger. She had no idea that I was no longer the woman who could be cornered into silence. One afternoon, I went to Luke's preschool gate, hoping only to see him for a few minutes. But Samantha appeared, yanking my hand away in front of all the other parents, coldly declaring, "This is his grandmother, but she's just the past in Luke's future. She has no place." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. All eyes turned toward me, some pitying, some curious. I bit my lip, clutching my handbag, saying nothing. But inside, a voice rang out clearly. "You'll soon see, I'm no longer the woman who stays silent." That evening, I sat by George's bed. He weakly held my hand, his tired eyes full of worry. "You've grown so thin. What is it you keep hiding from me?" I squeezed his hand lightly, forcing a smile. "It's nothing. Everything will be fine." But inside, I whispered a very different promise. It's time they saw the truth. I knew Samantha was confident she held all the power being Luke's mother, assuming that a frail old grandmother like me would inevitably bend. She was certain that sooner or later I would hand over all my assets, treating it as the price to keep some fragile connection with my grandson. But Samantha was wrong. The papers had been notarized, everything legal, airtight. The entire estate now bore Michael's name. Everything she thought surely belonged to her had already slipped beyond her grasp. Sitting in the stillness of the living room, I listened to the ticking of the clock mingled with the wind howling outside. I knew the real storm was about to begin. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Inside me, sorrow had hardened into resolve. That morning, the sky was unusually dark. As I prepared breakfast for George, he suddenly clutched his chest, gasping for breath. Panicked, I called for an ambulance. Thankfully, after the doctor examined him, they concluded it was only a mild heart attack, but warned his condition could worsen if not carefully managed. I sat by him, wiping the sweat from his forehead, my heart twisting. I knew I could not let his remaining days be clouded by anxiety. At that very moment, I decided it was time to reveal the truth. I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't keep it hidden in a drawer. I called Mr. Thomas Dalton, asking him to come to the house that afternoon. I also requested that he contact Samantha and Michael, the ones who needed to hear it all. By afternoon, the sky had grown heavy, autumn winds whipping outside the window. I carefully arranged the living room, setting a pot of hot tea on the table. George sat back in his chair, frail but his eyes steady. I sat beside him, hand in hand, my heart racing yet strangely calm. Samantha arrived first, draped in an expensive coat, her face perfectly made up. She walked in with a bright smile, but her eyes were full of arrogance, as though this meeting were just a formality to confirm what she already believed was hers. She gave George and me a slight nod, then sat down with her arms crossed, waiting. Michael came after in his simple shirt, his hands still marked with garden soil. He stepped in, nodded respectfully to us, his worried gaze lingering on George. I could see his sincerity clearly, which only strengthened my faith in my decision. Dalton opened his briefcase and placed a stack of documents on the table. He spoke slowly today, at Mrs. Margaret's request. I will read the new will, which has been notarized and made fully legal. Everyone here will bear witness. I looked at Samantha. She leaned back in her chair, lips curled into a triumphant smile, and Michael. He sat quietly beside us, his hands clasped, his eyes drifting toward Luke, who was playing in the corner of the room with a few toys. Dalton began to read, his voice loud and clear, each word echoing through the quiet room. At first, Samantha's expression was calm, even somewhat satisfied. But when he reached the words, "All assets are to be transferred to Mr. Michael Harris," the air in the room exploded. Samantha shot to her feet, her chair crashing to the floor. Her face flushed red, her eyes bulging.
What?
Impossible. This is outright betrayal. Her scream rang out so loudly that Luke startled and burst into tears. I remained seated, calm, my hand gripping George's tightly. I didn't respond, only met Samantha's gaze with quiet but unwavering resolve. Dalton continued, his voice unchanged. All documents have been notarized and registered with the local court. This decision is entirely legal and cannot be overturned. George, though weary, forced himself to speak, his voice weak but clear. This is my wife's decision, and I believe it's also what Daniel would have wanted had he lived. Michael sat silently, his hands clenched so tightly they trembled. He bowed his head, saying nothing, but in his eyes I saw a glimmer of deep emotion. Samantha screamed, "I'm Luke's mother. I'm the one with the right." Dalton calmly replied, "Motherhood rights and inheritance rights are two different matters. Mrs. Margaret has full authority to dispose of her own property. And according to this will, guardianship is granted to Mr. Michael." The moment Dalton finished, the room erupted. I saw Samantha trembling, her lips pressed tight, her eyes full of hatred, unable to believe what she'd just heard. Meanwhile, I sat still, calmer than ever. I knew the real battle was only beginning, but at least the truth had now been revealed. I looked over at George, who gave me a faint, weak nod. Samantha cried out in rage. "Why? On what grounds do you treat me this way? I am Luke's mother. His blood runs through me. And yet you hand everything to an outsider. You're cruel." Her shriek sent Luke into another sobbing fit. I quickly stood, ready to take him in my arms. But Samantha blocked my way, slamming her hand down on the table so hard the teacups rattled. "I'll sue. I'll prove you're no longer of sound mind. A senile old woman has no right to make this decision." I drew a deep breath, steadying myself. For all the humiliation she had inflicted on me before, I had stayed silent. But this time, I felt no fear. Dalton immediately pulled out the file and slammed it on the table. Mrs. Margaret was completely lucid throughout the drafting of her will. All documents were notarized and confirmed by the court. Nothing can be reversed. Samantha's face burned red, her clenched fist shaking. She whipped around to Michael, her voice spitting each word like venom. Who are you to take everything? You're not family. You have no right. Michael sat down, wrapping his arms around Luke, who was hiccuping in fear. He didn't answer her attack, only whispered softly into the boy's ear. It's okay. I'm here now. Watching that, my heart ached. Yet I also felt relief because someone truly cared about Luke, not just themselves. Luke's cries echoed through the room, drowning everything else out. Samantha grew increasingly unhinged, her face twisted with rage. She spun back toward me, spitting words like poison. If I can't have anything, then I don't want this child either. You deal with him. The words cut like a knife. I froze, not because I was insulted, but because the raw truth lay bare before me. Samantha had never truly loved Luke. It had all been a facade. She flung her hand, leaving her son crying in Michael's arms, and stormed out, her heels pounding hard against the wooden floor. The door slammed behind her, leaving a cold emptiness. Luke trembled, ran into my arms, clinging to my neck, sobbing. Grandma, Mommy left me. Don't go. Please don't go. My heart shattered. I held him tight, my tears falling into his soft hair. All the pain and humiliation I had endured seemed to pour out in that one moment. George slumped in his chair, his hands trembling, but his eyes softened. He sighed and whispered, "The mask has fallen." Margaret said, "We've seen her true self now." Dalton was silent for a moment. He nodded slightly and said softly, "Perhaps this is the strongest proof yet that your decision was the right one." I didn't answer. I only held Luke tighter, feeling his tiny heart pounding wildly. A strange tide rose in me. Pain at its deepest, yet also a sense of release. Pain because I had to watch my daughter-in-law abandon her own child. Relief because I no longer had to torment myself with the question, am I being unfair to Samantha? She had exposed the answer herself. In that moment, I felt as though Daniel whispered in my ear, "Mom, your grandson won't be alone. Luke will be loved." I held the boy even closer, silently promising my son, "Wherever he is, I will protect this child with everything I have left." Beside me, Michael kept patiently stroking Luke's back, his eyes full of restraint, yet burning with anger. I knew he was holding himself back from lashing out at the cruel words hurled at him. Instead, he poured all his gentleness into the boy. Outside, the wind howled, scattering fallen leaves. In the little room, we sat gathered around the sobbing child. I knew that from the moment Samantha walked away, Luke's life had turned down a different path. That path might still be hard, but at least it would no longer be bound by the grip of a selfish mother. I bent down, kissed his hair, and whispered, "Don't worry, Luke. Grandma won't leave you. You will always have a family." I sat there, clutching my grandson with all my frail strength, as if letting go would cause him to vanish. The pain inside me lingered, but beneath it was something else clear, firm. From this moment on, I would never let Luke be abandoned again. Michael pulled his chair closer and sat beside us. Gently, he wrapped an arm around the boy's small back. "You're okay, Luke." "I'm here," he murmured, his voice so tender it tightened my throat. Luke trembled, his little hands gripping Michael's shirt, his sobs slowly fading as he buried his face in Michael's shoulder. The sight brought tears to my eyes. I saw Daniel's reflection in every gesture. The way Michael patiently held the child, the way he set aside his own hurt to shield him. George, leaning back in his chair, weak but still forcing himself to speak, said hoarsely, with pauses between each word, yet full of conviction, "Michael, perhaps God has sent you here to take Daniel's place in caring for this boy. These caused it in Tang that is not or raised Tang the yes. These caused it in Tang the dactic." Michael gently squeezed Luke's shoulder, then lifted his head to look at us. His eyes were glistening, but his voice was steady and firm. "Don't worry, I'll raise Luke. I don't see this inheritance as mine, only as something I hold in trust until Luke is grown. When he's old enough, Everything will belong to him. That's my promise. Dalton nodded, his voice confirming. What you've said can be officially recorded in the legal documents. That way, no one can dispute it. The estate will only serve as security. Luke will be the true owner in the future. Choking up, I turned to Michael. You really mean that? Michael looked at me directly, his gaze unwavering. Daniel was my brother. I've long considered you both my parents and Luke as my own child. I promise I'll care for him with everything I have. Hearing those words, my heart overflowed. All the months of fear, all the resentment dissolved in an instant. I understood that someone as old and frail as I, already tending to a sick husband, could never fully care for a growing child. I knew, too, that my age and slowness would leave me powerless against the challenges of raising a boy. But from this moment on, I no longer felt alone. I had Michael not only as a legal guardian, but as a son fate had given me in return. Luke lifted his face, his eyes still wet with tears. He stared at Michael for a long while, then suddenly blurted out in his innocent little voice, "Uncle." The whole room went silent. I froze. George trembled and covered his face with his hand. Michael flinched, his eyes brimming with tears. In that moment, no one spoke another word. Only Luke's sobs filled the room, but I knew he had just found a new anchor in his life. I broke down, unable to stop the hot tears streaming down my cheeks. George smiled weakly, his face softening as if a heavy burden had been lifted. He whispered, "That's right. That's right, my son." Looking at the scene before me, I felt a sudden lightness in my heart. After all the heavy, dark days when the world seemed to hold nothing but shadows, now in this small room, a light had been kindled. I believed Daniel up above was smiling too, watching his best friend hold his son. Hearing Luke call out so innocently, I turned to Dalton, my voice trembling. "Please write down what Michael has promised. I want everything to be clear without a single loophole." Dalton nodded. "I'll take care of it immediately. You can rest assured." I sat back down, embracing Luke once more. The boy had stopped crying. Only the faint sound of sniffles remained, but his little hands still clung tightly to me and to Michael. In that moment, I felt a peace I hadn't known in so long. I whispered softly, "My son, I found someone to take your place. Michael will care for Luke and me. I will be here watching over them." That night, after everyone had gone, I sat by George's bed, holding his hand. He looked at me, his eyes gentle. "Margaret, I feel at peace. Perhaps we've done the right thing." I nodded, smiling through tears. Yes, at last I felt the great burden in my heart lift away. In loss, I had found new faith, and I knew Daniel in heaven was at peace too. From the day the will was revealed, our little house was no longer as quiet as before. Even though Samantha disappeared, the memory of that confrontation still lingered in my heart. At first, I feared she would return to make trouble, but in the weeks that followed, not once did I see her shadow at the door. Rumors spread quickly in our small town. I heard from neighbors that Samantha had fallen into gambling, drowning in debt. Some even claimed to have seen her chased by creditors at a bar on the edge of the city. I listened in silence. I no longer wanted to concern myself. Everyone chooses their own path, and Samantha had pushed herself farther and farther from the very child she was supposed to protect. Meanwhile, Michael and Dalton began handling the legal procedures for Michael to officially become Luke's guardian. The paperwork was completed swiftly, formalizing his rights and responsibilities. I watched the process with both deep emotion and relief. Documents might just be procedures, but to me they were a final shield protecting my grandson. Luke moved in with Michael into a small house not far from ours. Michael was so thoughtful that every weekend he brought the boy back to visit us. Each time Luke would rush into the house, his little arms wrapping around my neck, laughing with delight. That laughter filled our once quiet home with life. Because of that, George's spirits improved. His heart still needed medication and required regular checkups, but I could see he was lighter, no longer so tense. Once he whispered to me, "I think I've lived longer because I get to hear my grandson laugh." I smiled, silently thanking God for giving us more peaceful days. Our house, once so cold after Daniel's death, had become a place where Luke ran and played each weekend. I remembered watching him race across the yard with a ball while Michael stood nearby, smiling gently, guiding his every move. I stood on the porch, clutching Daniel's old shawl, feeling an unfamiliar warmth fill me. I saw my son alive again in each of Luke's steps, in each of his innocent smiles. Often, Luke would tug me into the garden, begging me to tell him stories of his father. I would sit on the rocking chair, the boy curled up in my lap, his eyes glowing with curiosity. I told him how Daniel, as a child, loved climbing trees and how mischievously he once ran all over the yard. Luke would laugh out loud, then hug me tightly. I want to be like Dad, and like Uncle Michael, too. Hearing that, my heart ached, but it was an ache filled with happiness. One chilly evening, the whole family sat together in the living room. George leaned back in his chair. I tucked a blanket around him while Luke played with wooden blocks on the floor. Michael handed me a cup of hot tea, his voice steady. "Don't worry, I'll never treat the estate as mine. It's all Luke's, and I just want him to grow up surrounded by love." I looked at him and saw a sincerity that could not be denied. I nodded gently, whispering, "Daniel was truly lucky to have a friend like you, and we are just as lucky to have gained another son." George heard this and smiled faintly, yet radiantly. He took my hand and whispered, "We did the right thing, Margaret. Now our son can finally rest in peace." In that moment, I knew that even though life was far from perfect, even though I had lost my only son, this family still existed, still held a new order, an order built on genuine love, not pretense. As night fell and Luke slept soundly in the guest bed, I sat in my familiar rocking chair. The warm glow of the lamp cast my shadow long across the wooden floor. Michael sat across from me, his eyes gentle, while George nodded drowsily beside him. The sound of Luke's laughter from earlier in the day still seemed to echo through the room. I realized that after all the bitterness I had endured, I still had the most precious things left: a warm home, a grandson who was loved, and now a man who had become a true companion to us. I told myself that for the rest of my days, I would cherish every single one of these peaceful moments. One quiet evening, when the autumn wind had stilled and the pale moon hung outside the window, George sat across from me in the living room, silently watching as I wrote down everything that had happened. When I set the pen down, he gently nodded and took my hand. His eyes were weak, but they shone with pride. "Margaret," he whispered, "you did what I didn't have the strength to do. I'm proud of you." One tear fell from my eyes, but this time they weren't bitter. They were tears of relief. Tiny footsteps echoed. Luke ran into my lap, his eyes sparkling like stars. He chattered excitedly about his afternoon playing soccer with Michael in the park. I held him close, feeling each steady beat of his small heart against my chest. Michael followed behind, holding the ball, his smile warm. His eyes met mine, and without a single word, I understood the message. "I will keep my promise." I nodded softly, a surge of indescribable faith welling inside me. Faith that family isn't only determined by blood, but by love, that there are bonds stronger than blood, sacrifice, devotion, and loyalty. I looked around our small house, George resting peacefully, Luke chattering in my arms, Michael standing nearby like a son. The room glowed with golden light, echoing with a child's laughter. It all felt like a miracle after so many storms. I whispered to myself, "This is what family truly is." I closed my journal and set it on the table. Inside me, all the pain seemed washed away. The silence I once chose was no longer a sign of weakness, but a kind of strength. That silence had allowed me to stand firm, to watch, and to wait for the right moment to protect what mattered most. I hugged Luke tighter and whispered into his ear, "You will always have a family, Luke. A real family." Outside, the autumn wind blew softly, no longer carrying the bitter chill of days past. The sky shone with bright moonlight, streaming through the window. In that gentle glow, I felt Daniel smiling, watching over us. And I knew that at last I had reached the end of a journey filled with tears, but also the beginning of a new chapter, one with love, with trust, and with a true home for my little grandson. The lesson from this story is not found in loss, but in how a woman turned grief into strength to protect what was most sacred. Blood ties do not always equal kinship, and sometimes those not bound by blood become the strongest support of all. Wealth is not meant to be handed to the greedy, but to safeguard love and security for the next generation. Silence is no longer weakness, but maturity, waiting for the moment to speak and make a decision that compels everyone to bow their heads in acknowledgement.